July 20th, 1969. 600 million people around the world watch as Neil Armstrong steps onto the surface of the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It's the greatest achievement in human history. American ingenuity, American courage, American triumph. But there's something the cameras don't show. Something NASA doesn't mention in the celebrations. The man who designed the rocket that got them there, the Saturn V, the most powerful machine ever built, is watching from Mission Control in Houston. His name is Wernher von Braun, and 25 years earlier, he was designing a different kind of rocket, the V-2, Hitler's vengeance weapon. A rocket that rained terror on London, that killed thousands of British civilians. A rocket built by prisoners in concentration camps, slaves who were worked to death in underground factories. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by it, and Wernher von Braun knew. He visited the factories, he selected the prisoners, he saw the bodies. But on July 20th, 1969, he's an American hero. Because in 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed, the United States government made a decision. A decision so morally compromising, so ethically bankrupt that it would be classified for decades. They decided that Nazi scientists, engineers and doctors, men who had committed war crimes, men who had served Hitler's regime, were too valuable to prosecute. So they brought them to America, gave them new identities, erased their pasts, put them to work. The operation was called Paperclip, and it would shape the next 50 years of American history. Welcome to Intellectuals' Lullaby. This is the true story of how America hired the Nazis, how war criminals became heroes, how morality was sacrificed for technology. It's a story of rocket science and human experimentation, of the space race and the Cold War, of documents that were destroyed and pasts that were rewritten. Some call it pragmatic, others call it a betrayal of everything World War II was fought for. But everyone agrees on one thing: without Operation Paperclip, America would not have reached the moon. The question is, was it worth it? To understand Operation Paperclip, we need to go back to May 1945. Germany has surrendered. Hitler is dead. The Third Reich is in ruins. But as Allied forces sweep through Germany, they make a discovery. The Nazis weren't just evil, they were technologically advanced, far more advanced than anyone had imagined. In the underground factories of Nordhausen, American soldiers find V-2 rockets, jet engines, guided missiles, technology that's years, perhaps decades, ahead of anything America possesses. And scattered throughout Germany, hiding in villages, mountains, and occupied zones, are the scientists who created it. The Americans face a choice. These men are Nazis. Many are war criminals. They used slave labor. They experimented on prisoners. They served Hitler loyally. Under the principles established at Nuremberg, they should be prosecuted, tried for crimes against humanity. But there's a problem. The Soviet Union is doing the same calculation. Russian forces are sweeping through eastern Germany, capturing scientists, seizing documents, dismantling factories. And suddenly, the alliance that defeated Hitler is fracturing. A new war is beginning. Not with bullets, at least not yet, but with technology, with missiles and jets and atomic weapons. And America cannot afford to let the Soviets win. So, in September 1945, President Harry Truman signs a secret directive. It authorizes the military to bring German scientists to America, temporarily, for intelligence purposes only. The directive has one clear requirement: no war criminals, no committed Nazis, only scientists whose expertise outweighs their past. That requirement would be systematically ignored. The operation is given a code name based on the paperclips that were attached to the files of scientists deemed valuable: Operation Paperclip. And it begins with rockets. The prize, the scientist every intelligence agency in the world wants, is Wernher von Braun. Von Braun is 33 years old in 1945. Brilliant, charismatic, ambitious. He's been obsessed with rockets since childhood, dreamed of space travel, of reaching the moon. But to build his rockets, he needed funding, resources, a patron. And in 1933, he found one. The Nazi Party. Von Braun joined the SS, rose to the rank of Sturmbannführer, equivalent to a major. He designed the V2 for Hitler, called it the vengeance weapon, watched as it was launched at London. Over 3,000 V2 rockets were fired at Allied cities. They killed nearly 10,000 people. But the V2 wasn't just a weapon. It was the world's first ballistic missile, the first man-made object to reach space. And it was built at an enormous cost. The Mittelwerk factory, buried in the Harz Mountains, was a nightmare. 60,000 prisoners, mostly from concentration camps, were forced to build rockets in underground tunnels. No sunlight, barely any food. Brutal working conditions. They worked 16-hour shifts, slept in overcrowded barracks, died by the thousands. More than 20,000 prisoners died at Mittelwerk from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and execution. And Wernher von Braun visited regularly. Survivors testified that von Braun walked through the factory, selecting prisoners for specific tasks, observing the production. He knew what was happening. He saw it with his own eyes. But in May 1945, as Germany collapses, von Braun makes a decision. He doesn't try to hide. He doesn't flee to Argentina like other Nazis. He surrenders to the Americans, specifically, because von Braun understands something crucial. He has knowledge the Americans desperately need, and he's willing to trade it for his freedom. American intelligence officers interview him, examine his credentials, his expertise, and they make a recommendation. Bring him to America. There's just one problem. Von Braun's past. His SS membership. His role at Mittelwerk. So the intelligence officers do something extraordinary. They rewrite his file. His SS membership is described as honorary. His role at Mittelwerk is downplayed. His connection to slave labor is omitted. A new narrative is created. Von Braun was a scientist, not a Nazi. A dreamer who was forced to work for Hitler. A victim of circumstances. It's a lie, but it's a useful lie. And in September 1945, Wernher von Braun arrives in America. He's not alone. Operation Paperclip brings over 120 German scientists in its first wave. Rocket engineers, aerodynamics experts, chemists, physicists. They're sent to military bases across America. Fort Bliss in Texas, White Sands in New Mexico, Wright-Patterson in Ohio. They're given new identities, new backgrounds, security clearances, and they go to work. At White Sands, von Braun and his team begin testing captured V2 rockets, launching them into the New Mexico desert. The knowledge they bring transforms American rocketry overnight. But not everyone is comfortable with this. The State Department raises objections. These men are Nazis, war criminals. They shouldn't be in America. Scientists who fled Nazi Germany, Jewish refugees who lost family members in the Holocaust, protest. Albert Einstein, who escaped Germany in 1933, is horrified. But the military argues back. The Soviets are doing the same thing. If we don't use these scientists, the Russians will. And in the emerging Cold War, that argument wins. Operation Paperclip expands. The temporary arrangement becomes permanent. By 1950, over 500 German scientists are working in America, and their pasts are being systematically erased, but some secrets are harder to bury than others. Before we go deeper into this story, if you're finding yourself drawn into this moral complexity, this hidden chapter of history, consider subscribing to Intellectual's Lullaby. We explore the uncomfortable truths that shaped our world, the decisions made in shadows, the compromises that built the modern age. New stories every week, designed to engage your mind while letting your body drift into rest. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? What do you think about this story so far? Leave a comment and let me know. I read every one. Now, let's talk about the man they called the father of space medicine. His name was Hubertus Strughold. In 1945, he was the director of the Luftwaffe's Institute for Aviation Medicine. His research focused on how the human body responds to extreme conditions: high altitude, low pressure, temperature extremes. Essential knowledge for developing jet aircraft and eventually spaceflight. Operation Paperclip identified him as a priority target. His expertise was invaluable. So, in 1947, Strughold was brought to America. Given a position at the School of Aviation Medicine in Texas, he became one of the most respected scientists in his field, published papers, trained American doctors, advanced aerospace medicine. In 1962, NASA opened the Hubertus Strughold Aeromedical Library in his honor. He was celebrated as a pioneer, a visionary, but there was something NASA didn't know, or chose not to know. During the war, Strughold's institute conducted experiments on prisoners. At Dachau concentration camp, prisoners were subjected to high-altitude experiments. They were placed in pressure chambers that simulated extreme altitudes: 30,000 feet, 40,000 feet, higher. The goal was to determine how long a pilot could survive at these altitudes without oxygen. The prisoners would gasp for air, convulse, their lungs would burst. Many died. Other experiments tested survival in freezing water. Prisoners were immersed in ice water for hours. Their body temperature was monitored as it dropped, as they went into shock, as they died, all to determine how long a downed pilot could survive in the North Atlantic. These weren't medical experiments, they were torture disguised as science. And Hubertus Strughold knew about them. Documents show he attended meetings where these experiments were discussed. He reviewed the data, he approved funding. Whether he personally conducted the experiments is unclear, but he was certainly aware of them. And he did nothing to stop them. This information was in his file when Operation Paperclip evaluated him. But the officers in charge made a decision. Strughold's expertise was too valuable. His knowledge could save American lives. So they classified the damaging documents, rewrote his background, and brought him to America anyway. For decades, Strughold was honored as a hero of space medicine. It wasn't until the 1980s that his past began to surface. Survivors came forward, documents were declassified, journalists investigated, and the truth emerged. NASA quietly removed his name from the library in 2016, but by then, Strughold was dead. He was never prosecuted, never held accountable. He lived a comfortable life in America, died of old age, with honors. And he's just one example. Arthur Rudolph was another. Rudolph worked with von Braun on the V2. He was the chief engineer at Mittelwerk, the man directly responsible for rocket production, which meant he was directly responsible for the prisoners who built them. Survivors testified that Rudolph was brutal, that he ordered beatings, that he pushed workers beyond human endurance, that when prisoners collapsed from exhaustion, they were sent to concentration camps to die. 20,000 deaths. And Arthur Rudolph was at the center of it. But in 1945, Operation Paperclip brought him to America. He joined von Braun at NASA, became the project director for the Saturn V rocket, the same rocket that took Neil Armstrong to the moon. For his contributions, Rudolph received NASA's highest honor, the Distinguished Service Medal. But in 1982, investigators began looking into his past. The Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, created to hunt Nazi war criminals, found evidence of his role at Mittelwerk. They gave Rudolph a choice: face prosecution or leave the country. Rudolph chose to leave. He renounced his American citizenship and returned to Germany. But he was never tried, never imprisoned. He lived freely until his death in 1996. And this pattern repeats over and over. Operation Paperclip brought in scientists who had clear connections to war crimes. Their files were sanitized, their pasts were hidden, and they were integrated into American military and civilian programs. The justification was always the same: we need their knowledge. The Soviets are our enemy now. We can't afford to be morally pure. But there's another question, a harder question. Did it work? Did Operation Paperclip actually give America the technological edge it sought? The answer is complicated. In rocketry, absolutely. Without Wernher von Braun and his team, America's space program would have been years, perhaps decades, behind. The Soviet Union had captured their own German scientists. The competition was real. Von Braun's knowledge accelerated American missile development dramatically. The Redstone rocket, the Jupiter missile, the Saturn series, all built on foundations laid by the V2. And in 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, it was von Braun's rocket that got him there. America won the space race. And Operation Paperclip played a crucial role. But the cost was enormous, not just morally, but practically. Because the decision to hire these scientists sent a message that if you're valuable enough, your crimes don't matter. That expertise can wash away guilt. That knowledge is more important than justice. And that message had consequences. In 1947, the United States conducted its own human experiments. At Vanderbilt University, pregnant women were given radioactive iron without their knowledge. At the Fernald School in Massachusetts, children with disabilities were fed radioactive oatmeal. These experiments were conducted by American scientists, but they used methods developed by the Nazis. The ethical boundaries that were crossed in Operation Paperclip made it easier to cross them again. If Nazi doctors could be forgiven for their experiments in the name of science, why couldn't American doctors do the same? This is the uncomfortable truth. Operation Paperclip didn't just bring German scientists to America, it brought German ethics, German methods, German willingness to sacrifice individuals for perceived greater goods. And once those boundaries were crossed, they were hard to restore. The CIA also saw an opportunity. If Operation Paperclip worked for rockets, why not for other areas? In the late 1940s, the CIA began recruiting Nazi intelligence officers, men who had run spy networks in Eastern Europe, who had expertise in Soviet operations. Reinhard Gehlen, a German general who had overseen military intelligence on the Eastern Front, was brought to America. He helped establish what would become the CIA's intelligence network in Europe. His organization, the Gehlen Organization, employed former Nazis, SS officers, and Gestapo agents, men who had committed atrocities during the war, who had hunted resistance fighters, who had rounded up Jews for deportation. But they knew the Soviets. They had contacts in Eastern Europe. They were useful. So the CIA gave them new identities, put them on the payroll, and used them throughout the Cold War. And when some of these men were exposed as war criminals, the CIA protected them, helped them flee to South America, gave them new identities again, because the mission was more important than justice. We're about halfway through this story now, and if you're still with me, you're the kind of person who doesn't look away from difficult truths. By subscribing to Intellectuals' Lullaby, you're joining a community that explores these hidden chapters, that asks hard questions, that believes understanding the past, even the uncomfortable past, matters. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment. Where are you listening from? What's your take on Operation Paperclip? Was it justified or a betrayal? I'm genuinely curious. This channel is a conversation. not a lecture. Now, let's talk about what happened when the truth started coming out. For decades, Operation Paperclip was classified. The American public had no idea that former Nazis were working on American military projects. Von Braun was presented as a German-American scientist. His Nazi past was mentioned, if at all, as a technicality. But in the 1970s, things began to change. The Vietnam War had eroded public trust in government. Watergate had revealed systematic lying at the highest levels, and journalists began digging into classified programs. In 1973, Linda Hunt, an investigative journalist, began researching Operation Paperclip. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests, interviewed former intelligence officers, tracked down scientists. What she found was staggering. Not only had Operation Paperclip brought in far more scientists than publicly acknowledged, but their backgrounds had been systematically whitewashed. SS memberships erased. War crimes omitted. Entire sections of files rewritten. Hunt published her findings in 1985 in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. The article caused a scandal. Congress held hearings. The Justice Department opened investigations. And for the first time, the full scope of Operation Paperclip became public. Over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians had been brought to America. Many had Nazi Party memberships. Some had been in the SS. A significant number had connections to war crimes. And all of this had been hidden for 40 years. The public reaction was divided. Some were outraged. How could America, which had fought a war to defeat Nazi evil, turn around and hire the very people who embodied that evil? Others were pragmatic. The Cold War was real. The Soviet threat was real. Moral purity was a luxury America couldn't afford. And some argued that the scientists themselves were victims, that they had been forced to work for the Nazis, that they deserved a second chance. But the survivors, the people who had actually suffered under these men, had a different perspective. They testified about what they'd seen. The beatings at Mittelwerk, the experiments at Dachau, the casual cruelty of scientists who treated human beings as disposable test subjects. And they asked a simple question. Why were these men never held accountable? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, comes down to priorities. For the American government in 1945, winning the Cold War was more important than prosecuting every Nazi. The decision-makers believed that Soviet expansion was an existential threat, that preventing communist domination of Europe justified almost any compromise, and that included compromising on justice. Whether that calculation was correct is still debated. Some historians argue that Operation Paperclip was essential, that without it, the Soviets would have gained an insurmountable technological advantage, that the space race which America won might have been lost, that the balance of power in the Cold War might have shifted. Others argue that it was unnecessary, that America had its own scientific talent, that the German scientists, while knowledgeable, weren't irreplaceable, that the moral cost was too high, that some principles shouldn't be compromised, even in war. And there's a third perspective. That Operation Paperclip wasn't really about technology at all. It was about denying that technology to the Soviets. The primary goal wasn't to gain an advantage. It was to prevent the other side from gaining one. And in that sense, it was successful. But success came with a price. The price was justice deferred, crimes unpunished, victims forgotten, and perhaps most troubling, a precedent set. That when national interest conflicts with moral principle, national interest wins. That the ends justify the means. That some people are above the law if they're useful enough. This isn't just ancient history. The logic of Operation Paperclip echoes through American foreign policy to this day. In the decades after World War II, America supported dictators, funded death squads, and overlooked human rights abuses, all in the name of fighting communism. The same calculation. the same rationalization. Our allies might be brutal, but they're better than the alternative. And after the Cold War ended, the pattern continued. In the War on Terror, the question became, do we prosecute terrorists who are willing to provide intelligence? Or do we make deals? Enhanced interrogation techniques, which many consider torture, were justified as necessary to protect American lives. Black sites, secret prisons, rendition programs, all echoes of the same logic. When security is at stake, rules can be bent. Operation Paperclip was one of the first times America made that calculation on a massive scale. And once that door was opened, it was never fully closed. Let's return to Wernher von Braun, because his story encapsulates all the contradictions of Operation Paperclip. Von Braun became the face of America's space program. He appeared on television, worked with Walt Disney to promote space exploration, became a celebrity scientist. He was charming, articulate, visionary. Americans loved him. When he spoke about reaching the moon, about building space stations, about exploring Mars, he inspired generations. Children wanted to become astronauts because of him. Engineers joined NASA because of him. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the American dream, an immigrant who came to America and helped achieve the impossible. But he was also a man with blood on his hands, a man who had served Hitler, who had worn an SS uniform, who had visited factories where prisoners died by the thousands. And he never truly acknowledged it. In interviews, von Braun would dismiss his Nazi past, say that he was just a scientist, that he had no choice. When asked about Mittelwerk, he claimed he didn't know about the conditions, that he had no authority over the prisoners. But survivors testified otherwise. They remembered him, remembered his visits, his inspections. Von Braun lived with this contradiction until his death in 1977, honored by NASA, celebrated by America, haunted by his past. At his funeral, he was eulogized as a hero, a pioneer, a man who helped humanity reach the stars. And in a sense, he was. The Saturn V rocket is one of the greatest engineering achievements in history. It worked flawlessly. It fulfilled Kennedy's promise to land a man on the moon. Without von Braun, that might not have happened. But the V2 rocket, his earlier creation, killed thousands, and the people who built it died in darkness underground. Both things are true. And that's the heart of the Operation Paperclip dilemma. These men contributed to human achievement, but they also participated in human atrocity. Can both be acknowledged? Should both be acknowledged? Or should we focus on one and ignore the other? There's no easy answer. Some argue that we should separate the achievement from the person, that the moon landing is a triumph for all humanity, regardless of who designed the rocket. Others argue that we cannot celebrate achievements built on suffering, that to honor von Braun without acknowledging the victims of Mittelwerk is to erase their pain. And some argue that the whole framing is wrong, that it's not about von Braun at all. It's about the American government's decision to prioritize technology over justice. Von Braun was given a choice: surrender and face prosecution, or work for America and gain protection. He chose survival, as most people would. The real question is why America offered that choice in the first place. By the 1980s, the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations was actively hunting Nazi war criminals. They investigated dozens of Operation Paperclip scientists. Some, like Arthur Rudolph, were forced to leave the country. Others had already died and escaped accountability entirely. A few faced legal action, but were never successfully prosecuted due to lack of evidence or jurisdictional issues. The vast majority were never investigated at all. Because by the 1980s, they were elderly, retired. Many were sick or dying, and the government had to weigh whether prosecuting them was worth the scandal it would create. Admitting that NASA employed war criminals would be embarrassing, damaging to America's reputation. So, most cases were quietly dropped. Before we close, I want to hear from you. This is one of the most morally complex stories in modern history. There's no clean answer, no obvious right or wrong. So leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Was Operation Paperclip justified? Would you have made the same decision in 1945? And where are you listening from? I love knowing that this channel reaches people around the world. Subscribe to Intellectuals Lullaby for more stories like this. Stories that don't have easy answers, that challenge us to think deeply about power, morality, and the choices that shaped our world. Now, let's bring this story to its close. Today, Operation Paperclip is no longer classified. The files, or what remains of them, are publicly available. Historians have spent decades piecing together what happened, who was brought to America, what they did during the war, what they contributed afterward. And the picture that emerges is complicated. Operation Paperclip undeniably accelerated American technological development. In rocketry, aerospace engineering, and military technology, the German scientists provided a crucial advantage. But that advantage came at a profound moral cost. Justice was denied to thousands of victims. War criminals lived free and comfortable lives. And a precedent was set that expertise can absolve guilt. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is how easily it was hidden. For 40 years, the American public had no idea. The scientists were integrated into society. Their pasts were buried. And when the truth finally emerged, it was too late for accountability. Most of the scientists were dead. The survivors of their crimes were elderly. The moment for justice had passed. This raises an uncomfortable question about secrecy and democracy. If a government can classify its moral compromises, can hide its decisions for decades, what other compromises are being made right now that we don't know about? What other Operation Paperclips are happening in shadows, to be revealed only when it's too late to matter? The original justification, fighting the Soviet threat, seemed urgent and necessary in 1945. But from our perspective today, knowing that the Soviet Union eventually collapsed without a nuclear war, that justification looks different. Was it worth it? Did Operation Paperclip actually prevent a greater evil, or did it simply create a different kind of damage? We'll never know for certain, because we can't run history twice. Can't see what would have happened if America had chosen differently. Maybe, without Operation Paperclip, the Soviets would have dominated the space race. Maybe the Cold War would have ended differently. Or maybe American scientists, given time and resources, would have caught up on their own. Maybe the moral high ground would have been worth more than the technological shortcut. We can only judge based on what happened. And what happened is that America hired Nazis, protected them, honored some of them, and in doing so, compromised the very principles the war was supposedly fought to defend. The men who designed the rockets that took us to the moon were the same men who designed the rockets that terrorized London. The men who advanced aerospace medicine were the same men who experimented on concentration camp prisoners. Both things are true. Both things matter. And perhaps the lesson of Operation Paperclip is that moral compromises, once made, are hard to undo. That justifications made in the moment can look very different decades later. That secrecy allows decisions to be made without accountability. And that expertise, no matter how valuable, cannot erase guilt. The victims of Mittelwerk, the prisoners who built the V2 in darkness, who died by the thousands, received no justice. The victims of Dachau, who were frozen and suffocated in medical experiments, received no justice. And the man who walked on the moon, Neil Armstrong, may never have known that the rocket that carried him was designed by a man who wore an SS uniform. That's the legacy of Operation Paperclip. Great achievement, terrible cost, and questions that still haunt us today. Sleep well, and remember, history is not a story of heroes and villains. It's a story of choices, made by people in impossible situations, under enormous pressure, with incomplete information. And sometimes those choices achieve great things while causing great harm. Both can be true. This has been Intellectual's Lullaby. Until next time, rest deeply, think carefully, and never stop questioning. Good night.